Sometimes you just gotta believe.
Hi, welcome to Storytime with Carrot. I'm Carrot. In this video, we'll be experiencing a story called A Wasted Future, written and narrated by me. This is all 4 chapters in one video, so grab yourself a cup of coffee and log into Minecraft. You may as well do some of that grindy stuff you need to do while I tell you a story.
Carrot's legacy has been sustained for a century. However, a new bandit king has recently emerged from the mire. Meaner, uglier, and far more vicious than the one before. In his time, he has largely undone everything that Carrot has strived for, all but wiping out the entire Carrot bloodline. Only one heir remains, and, as though her parents had known her future, she was named Carrot too.
Dear Uncle, I am safe. I don't know if I will ever find a way to get this to you. Luck willing, I'll see you first. Should this letter find you before I do, just know that I am safe. I hope above all hope that you are as well. When the bandits set fire to the town, they were looking for me. One of them saw me and alerted the others. I was unarmed and unprepared. They chased me across the waste for 2 days before we encountered a mangrove swamp. I was able to lose them amidst the sludge. I wandered for another couple of days before I found this uninhabited house. I'd say it was abandoned, but the person's skeleton was still on the floor. I buried them next to another grave nearby and found this paper amidst the things in the cabinet. I will return to claim my title as heir to the Carrot Empire someday, but not until I've dealt with the King of Bandits. He will pay for the destruction of my town, just as his beloved brother paid for the death of my father and brothers. At the end of my sword. All my love, your only niece, C2. Writing that letter to my uncle may have been a waste of time, but on the unlikely chance that I could find a way to send it to him, it was worth it. Besides, what pressing matters did I have to attend to anyway? My life as the pampered heir to the Carrot Empire had ended the day my father and brothers were slaughtered. I'd escaped to the safety of a step-uncle few knew existed, and from there plotted my revenge. By pure luck, the opportunity to follow through had arisen much sooner than I'd expected. Unfortunately, that didn't sit well with the King of Bandits, and his henchmen found me in the town I'd taken under my care years before. Had I known the greasy sludge-eater whose body I'd fed to the bears in the ice wastes was the brother of the bandit king, I'd have taken better care to conceal my location. But what was done, and my beautiful town was destroyed, burned to the ground by the brother of the man who slaughtered my family. Every day I promised myself that I would destroy the bandit king, just like my great-great-grandmother destroyed his predecessor 100 years ago. Every day I promised her memory that I would make it safe for the world to heal again. I decided to stay in the rundown house in the hillside for a little while. There were a few useful resources in the area, and a bunker nearby that would likely have a few things left over from whomever left it behind. Based on location, I assumed it was the owner of the skeleton I buried the first night I found this place. Or maybe that guy. I spent most of the following day just gathering wood and fixing the house. I didn't want anything coming in on me through the ceiling, and not knowing how long I'd stay in this place, I set up some storage. Eventually I'd leave behind most of what I found anyway. The next day, I made my way to an abandoned house nearby, and came out with a decent amount of food and some medical supplies. After taking a moment to enjoy being out of what was surely a death trap waiting to happen, I decided I had enough wood and headed into the swamp to gather one of the most important resources available in the wastelands, aloe. I noticed a young wolf pup sitting alone at the edge of a clearing and offered it a bone. She must have been half tamed to begin with, because she immediately began following me. I'd started this journey alone, my home destroyed and everything I loved gone, but that helpless creature needed me, and I began to once again feel a tiny sliver of hope. As I lay down to sleep in the house I'd repaired on my own, I knew what I would call the pup that lay snuggled beside me. I spent the rest of that first week digging around in the hill. I needed some iron, and digging a hole in the hill I was already living in seemed like the safest way to get my hands on some. By the end of that first week, I hadn't found a scrap of iron, but I'd managed to dig my way into a lush cave, one of the few places in the world that hadn't been laid to waste during the Great War. It was rumored that some of the first people to return to the surface were people who had taken shelter in these caves. Supposedly, there were entire cities hidden underground. I'd never seen one myself, but I'd seen enough of this world to know that anything was possible. The cave I found wasn't big enough for a city, but the glowberries I was able to harvest were enough to account for all the effort. Before I went to bed that night, I decided to spend the next few days searching the swamp for other empty houses. I had a list of things I needed, and I figured scavenging would be the fastest way to get most of them. The first day I'd gathered wood in the area, I'd seen a man-made monument at the edge of the trees, so I decided to check it out first. I didn't know what it was made of, but when I got close I saw there was iron in it and set to work, mentally kicking myself the whole time for not checking it out sooner. After taking the iron, I headed deeper into the swamp. I wasn't entirely sure what kinds of creatures made their home among the roots of the mangrove trees, but I'd seen enough to know people around here didn't last too long. Slogging my way through the thick, sticky mud, I began to seriously doubt my own sanity. The first house I encountered didn't have much in the way of resources, but I was pretty sure the skeleton on the floor wouldn't mind if I used his bag. I didn't know what I'd find on this scavenge, but I knew that I'd need space to carry it. I decided to make the trip a big circle and headed south, where I swam across the polluted channel and found a very interesting shrine to a giant white cat. I knew that people tended to seek out some sort of higher power in times of trouble, but I wasn't sure I'd have gone with a giant cat. I chose to leave the shrine alone. I didn't know what it represented, and the last thing I wanted to do was anger some strange cult of radioactive cat people. For all I know, they'd built the thing around a termite mound. I didn't want to take any chances with something that had that kind of potential. I found several more good places to loot, including a creeper nest. Funny thing about creeper nests, they're only active at night. Stealing their hoard during the day is really easy. On a random whim, I smashed a bit of tuff and uncovered a surface diamond. I immediately set to work making an iron pickaxe so I could dig it up. I couldn't do much with a single diamond, but a single diamond was a single diamond more than I'd had before. A little of this, a little of that, and more of the same. I trudged through the swamp at a leisurely pace, hope ever at my heels, and after 4 days I found myself back at the house on the hill. I scurried inside and took the time to unload my new backpack, putting everything away in a semi-organized manner. I silently sent out a thank you to whoever that skeleton had belonged to. I had a lot of stuff, and I couldn't have brought it back without the backpack. I hadn't gotten everything on my list, but I was pretty sure I had enough resources to justify spending the next day checking out the bunker. So that's exactly what I did. I was set. Med packs, bandages, aloe, meat that didn't have risky levels of radiation. I couldn't have come out of it better. I briefly enjoyed the satisfaction of a well-stocked medicine cabinet and decided to honor the lives of the people whose skeletons I'd found. Their losses had been my gain. I would go out and gather their bones and build them a place to finally rest in peace. It would be my thanks for their sacrifice, but it would have to wait until tomorrow. I decided to honor the memories of the people whose skeletons I'd found in my last scavenge trip. Their losses had been my gain, and it was the least I could do. With as much reverence as humanly possible under the circumstances, I gathered the bones of the dead. I moved as quickly as I dared. I wasn't interested in spending 4 days sleeping out like I had before, but I wanted to be sure I collected all the remains I'd found on my previous scavenge. I would give them a place to rest in peace, a mausoleum with wards to protect it from anyone with ill intent. I built the mausoleum using some of the resources I'd gathered from the ruined houses in the bunker. The walls were mostly built with cobblestone bricks, and I used steel blocks and polished deep slate as an accent. The roof was steeply pitched and made of fully aged copper and tinted glass that had once surrounded the power cells in the bunker. The floor inside was white, made of calcite and polished diorite. I gave each skeleton its own spot on one of the shelves I built along the walls, and in the center of the room I placed a flawless diamond, a token of my appreciation for what had been lost when these souls were freed from this existence. I didn't know how any of them had died, but I knew that being alive meant I was one of the lucky ones. As I sealed the door to the mausoleum, I looked at what I'd built. It had turned out exactly as I'd imagined it, and I felt certain that if any of those lost had family out there, they would appreciate the effort. I spent the next day just playing with hope. I knew I had things to do, but it had been an emotional month. When I'd awoken that morning, it had hit me like a ton of bricks. It had been a whole month since I'd lost everything. A month since I'd fled for my life. I'd been on high alert since I'd found this place 3 weeks ago, and I needed a day to try to enjoy life. After a day of leisure, I was feeling much better, and by the time I went to bed, I had decided that the next day I would start making plans to climb to the Sky City floating in the clouds above my head. Sky cities had existed almost since the first survivors had emerged from underground. Much had been lost during the Great War that destroyed the world, but magic had been freed. Magic had set the Sky Cities floating, and it was magic that kept them up there. I'd never been to a Sky City myself, but before my town had burned, we'd had trade agreements in place with a couple of different ones. Specially trained groups of people called the Winged were responsible for carrying goods to and from the Cloudbound. Skill with elytra was paramount to such an arrangement. However, toting cargo was only a secondary job for the Winged. They were more specifically responsible for maintaining peace between settlements and arranging trade agreements on behalf of whatever town they were employed by. Being one of the Winged was an honor no matter where you went, something akin to knighthood in the Middle Ages of the Old World. When I was a young child, I dreamt of being trained as one of them. My plan was to locate one of the Winged and ask them to deliver the letter I'd written to my uncle. But first I had to get up there. Considering my circumstances, I didn't really have a lot of options, so I settled on building a dirt pillar. Perhaps not the fastest or safest way up, but certainly the most attainable. It only took me a few hours to collect enough dirt blocks to make the journey. So, 3 days after finishing the mausoleum, I left Hope at the house on the hill and pillared my way up to the city in the clouds. When I reached a point about 150 meters up, I stopped to take in the view. I was, without question, a crazy person, but I had to let my uncle know that the Carrot legacy would live on. When I got up to the receiving zone of the Sky City, I took a moment to look around me. It could have been any other town in the wastes, except instead of grass, there were solid clouds, and instead of paths, there were wooden walkways. The buildings were made of what seemed like every form of pristine white quartz the citizens could get their hands on. I don't know what I'd expected, but it wasn't that. While I didn't know much about Sky Cities, I did know that every one of them had a pub. It was practically a requirement in order for one of these towns to exist, and it was usually the best place to meet the kind of people I was looking for. Finding the pub was easy, and I was only a little surprised to find it completely empty of any citizens besides the barkeep. "Hi there," he said as I approached the bar. "How can I help you?" "Hi, is this the only pub in town?" I asked. "Sure is. People start showing up around 5, but until then it's pretty quiet." "I heard you lot like to work. How often do you see the Wing?" I asked. "Oh, they come around once every couple of weeks. They were just in yesterday. Said there's new construction on the ground," he answered. "Righto," I said, ignoring his bait. He was clearly fishing. "In that case, I'd better get back to the surface. Things to do, bandits to slaughter. You know, life in the wastes." I could tell by the look he gave me that this kid didn't have a clue. The sheltered lives of the Sky People was clearly reflected in the startled way he'd reacted to my casual suggestion of ending bandit life. The surface dwellers had never been so innocent. Even before the Great War, people were unfazed by the slaughter of other people. I wanted to take the kind of idyllic peace and safety of the Sky City back to the surface. If only I could trap it in a bottle somehow. As I headed back down my pillar of dirt, I contemplated my options. It hadn't sounded like the Winged that visited them kept a very precise schedule. I could easily hang around for a couple of weeks and make the climb again, but I couldn't be sure I'd catch one of the Winged. Alternatively, I could move on, but I needed to be sure I was moving toward the Bandit King's hideout, and I wasn't quite sure yet where that was. I contemplated my options all night, and the following morning I set out with Hope close at my heels. I wasn't moving on, but I didn't want to wait another 2 weeks if I didn't have to. So I set out to see if I could find a surface town within a couple days' travel.
Swear I won't forget this, why do I regret this? In my mind reckless, thoughts are feeling endless. Sitting up I'm breathless, anxiety's infectious. I feel so defenseless, betrayed and embarrassed. I hate being open, I hate being broken. I feel like an ocean filled up with emotion. Anger ain't a potion, rub it on like lotion. I can feel it soaking, reopen, the scars have awoken. I can't move on till I let go. I feel so lost, never at home. Need to be strong, every breath hold. Cause I can't move on till I let go. I can't move on till I let go. I feel so lost, never at home. Need to be strong, every breath hold. Cause I can't move on till I let go. The pain makes it real. I don't wanna feel, I just wanna kill the bad thoughts and steal a good thought and feel. I'm just lost, I feel, I'm just lost, I feel. I need time to heal, I can't steer the wheel. Cause this drive it kills, and it gives me chills. A nice road it feels, I slip off the peel and crash all the steel. Will I ever heal? I can't move on till I let go. I feel so lost, never at home. Need to be strong, every breath hold. Cause I can't move on till I let go. I can't move on till I let go. I feel so lost, never at home. Need to be strong, every breath hold. Cause I can't move on till I let go.
I traveled for exactly 2.5 days. It was a relatively pleasant journey, and in many ways I was glad to make it. I'd found some beautiful areas I didn't know existed and discovered that a part of me really loved the wasteland. It was fascinating, constantly growing and evolving, an incredible work of natural art, and yet the only reason I got to enjoy it was because people had forgotten how awesome the world we lived in was. They'd forgotten their connection to it, and in their greed they destroyed it. For a moment, I allowed myself to bask in the awe of knowing that everything that had happened had allowed me to exist in this precise moment. I stumbled into the town on the third day. I was tired of sleeping out. The beauty of the world did not translate into being soft or comfortable by any means, and sleeping out had given me bruises in places I didn't know bruises could go. I was desperate for a hot soak and a soft place to sit. I found the local inn without trouble, and made arrangements for a room. I also requested a tub be brought up at an additional cost, of course. I was going to have to work most of the following day to pay the innkeeper back, but for now, I was going to take the first hot bath I'd had in a month. I led Hope into my rented room. Tomorrow I would have to inquire if this town employed any of the winged, but not until I'd washed off the stench of the wastes. Waking up in a clean bed was glorious, and I started the day feeling like the queen of the world. I guess technically, based on lineage, I pretty much was, but that needed to remain a secret until after I dealt with the king of bandits. I made my way to the dining room and ordered a couple of fried eggs. As I munched them down, enjoying their savory flavor, I watched the people in the room. All of them ordinary people doing ordinary things, none of them knowing who I really was. After I ate, I had a chat with the owner of the inn and said about the various tasks she assigned me to pay my debt. By 2 o'clock, I was free to inquire about the winged, and I struck up a conversation with the barkeep. I learned that the town itself didn't have any of the winged in their employ, but they frequently traveled through on their routes. I just needed to bide my time. I spent 4 days working for room and board, with no sign of the winged, and I was beginning to feel restless. I knew I would encounter one of them eventually, but I also knew that time could be subjective in the wastes, and the word frequent didn't necessarily mean often. I was stewing on that matter over a cup of hot tea when I heard the sound I hadn't even known I was listening for until that moment. One of the winged had finally landed. I watched the door intently, trying to contain my excitement. It wouldn't be very queenly to appear starstruck over someone I may one day hire for the Empire, but I was indeed excited. If I could convince this wing to deliver the letter I'd written to my uncle without giving away my identity, that would be ideal. However, the wing didn't do favors for strangers without some kind of bribe, and the calluses on my hands were proof enough that I had little more than my skills to offer. When the door opened, the plan I had fine-tuned over the last few days crumbled to pieces. I knew this winged better than I knew anyone else in the world. The winged were trained to scan a room in an instant, and I could tell the precise moment he saw me. My heart skipped a beat as excitement flashed in his keen eyes, but he headed toward the bar without so much as a nod. I went to my room as quickly as I could without drawing attention and sat on the edge of the narrow bed to think. He had known to keep quiet, and that meant I was in a lot more trouble than I thought. I decided to leave that night. I would send payment for the room later, but I knew by the way Jarek had turned away that the bounty on my head was being extended to more than just the Bandit King's henchmen, and that meant it had to be a big one. I stayed in my room all day and into the night, until the sounds of the town stilled to a soft murmur. After tossing my bag out the window, I led Hope out through the front door. I'd let anyone who saw me assume I was taking her for a midnight walk, until I didn't return. I grabbed my bag and ambled toward the dock. The fastest way out of here, without wings, was definitely by boat. As luck would have it, no one on the docks paid any attention to me walking my dog, and likewise, no one noticed as I slipped silently away into the starlit sea. I hadn't gotten far when I heard a whoosh above my head and a piece of paper fluttered into my lap. Scrawled hastily across the page were 4 words: "Meet me, 3 days," and a series of numbers. I was immediately thankful for my childhood obsession of the winged that had led me to learn how to decipher their number codes. I knew exactly which way to go, so I pointed my boat east and paddled my way to my dreams. As the sun rose on the second day, a city appeared in the distance. If my calculations were correct, the meeting place was either inside that city or just on the other side of it. I decided I wouldn't dawdle, but I did want to see what was on the ground floor of a couple of those buildings. I scavenged around for a bit, found a few useful things, and by sunset I had picked my way across the city. There, at the very edge of the city, poking out of the side of a hill, was a place Jarek had picked. It was a tiny chapel, remarkably intact, with none of its stained glass windows broken. Its bell tower stood tall and proud, and I could see the faintest glimmer of gold from a bell that still hung below the high spired roof. Although the entrance was a bit buried, it was obvious that people used this place regularly. I wasn't sure how this could possibly be the safest place for a secret meeting, but I trusted Jarek. So glancing around me, alert for prying eyes, I ducked inside. The interior was comfortably warm against the chill of the falling night, and the little man at the front of the room smiled in a way that suggested he'd been expecting me. "He's already waiting in his office," he said. "Please follow me quietly." He led me through a door at the base of the bell tower and down a spiral staircase to a narrow passage that widened momentarily but then almost immediately narrowed into another steep staircase going up. At the top of the stairs was a dark passageway that turned abruptly into a very short corridor lit by a soul torch that seemed too bright. The old man led me through a narrow doorway before my eyes had fully adjusted and told me to watch my steps seconds too late as I stumbled unceremoniously into a knee-deep puddle. My eyes adjusted and I cringed. We were in the sewer of the city I'd just walked through. I followed the old man, staying close to the walls, trying to avoid the slimy water that slithered down the center of the sewer floor. After dozens of turns, some of which I was certain had led us in complete circles more than once, we stood before a heavy wooden door. The old man knocked 3 times with the hilt of his dagger, then turned the knob. We stepped down into a narrow chamber with books and papers piled everywhere. Maps of the wastes covered the walls and table surfaces, and Jarek sat in a chair behind a desk that had clearly been down there for far too long. "Carrot, I'm glad you were able to find the place," he said, as though he'd simply invited me for coffee at a new cafe. "Oh, yeah, no problem at all. Didn't even have to stop for directions," I said, playing into his joke. The old man grunted his disapproval at our frivolous behavior and left the room with a huff. Jarek and I immediately started laughing. After an embarrassingly long time, I managed to regain control of myself. The pressure of life on the run could get to anyone. Sometimes it came out in laughter, but more often it came out in tears. I was thankful that this time it had been laughter. Once Jarek had assured me that he was in control of the city above us, I felt safe enough to allow myself a chance to relax and spent the rest of the night catching up with my best friend. By sunrise, I had learned that ever since I'd escaped the Bandit King's henchmen in the swamp, there had been a hefty bounty on my head. The Winged were doing everything in their power to keep the information from spreading too quickly, but when magic had been freed, the portals to alternate dimensions had been reopened, and the Winged were pretty sure the King of Bandits was also the new King of the Nether. I learned that a couple years ago, several of the Winged had formed an elite squad under the command of General Whitethorn. The elites were a good way into planning how they'd conquer the King of Bandits when they learned exactly where his hideout was in the Nether Dimension. General Whitethorn had planned a meeting with the Bandit King by tricking him into thinking he could arrange an alliance with the Winged. However, the general had gone into the Nether 2 weeks ago, and no one had seen or heard from his party since. Jarek, being second in command, ended up in charge of the whole operation. I'd also learned that immediately upon seeing me at the inn that day, Jarek had sent his fastest messenger to tell my uncle that I was still alive. When my stomach growled loudly enough to wake the dead, Jarek led me back into the sewer to another heavy wooden door next to his office. On the other side of the door was another long, narrow room. Jarek led the way to a counter at the back of the room, behind which a short, stocky woman in an apron wielded a ladle as deftly as an artist with a paintbrush. She filled 2 bowls to the very brim without spilling a single drop of the steaming, foul-smelling slop and slid them across the counter with a twinkle in her eye. Jarek took both bowls and led me to a table across the room. "Helda loves feeding new people," he said, as he set a bowl of stinky slop in front of me. I eyed the slop in the bowl and silently questioned the motives of someone who found joy in serving such unappetizing sludge to a guest. I was hungry, though, and I'd eaten far worse during my time in the swamp, so I lifted the bowl to my lips and took a sip of the most heavenly golden carrot soup I had ever tasted. Jarek laughed at the look of surprise on my face. "That's her magic," he said. "If you can get past the way it looks and smells at first, you get to experience a flavor uniquely tuned to being superbly delicious to you specifically." "So yours tastes different?" I asked. "To me it does," he responded, sipping his slop slowly, clearly savoring it. "Wow," I breathed and gulped down the remainder of the delicious slop, barely stopping myself from licking the bowl. Seconds later, another bowl of foul-smelling slop appeared in front of me. I nodded to Helda and reminded myself that I was a queen as I resisted the urge to slurp down the entire bowl as hastily as I had the previous one. With a belly full of delicious slop and eyelids heavy from days of travel and little rest, I followed Jarek out into the sewer to yet another narrow room behind a wooden door. "Guest quarters. Take your pick. You're the only visitor we have," Jarek said. "I'll show you the bathing rooms after you get some sleep." I curled up on the bed behind the nearest door, and with Hope sitting guard, I fell asleep, thinking about the irony of bathing rooms in a sewer. I'd been at the sewer outpost for a week. In that time, I'd learned as much as I possibly could about the plans the winged elite had concocted to finally dispose of the king of bandits. I'd also learned that there was only one way I was going to be of any use, but as I stood atop the tallest building in the city, I wasn't sure I was ready to do what I was about to do. The weight of the wings on my back was a physical representation of the weight of the legacy I was fighting for. The peace of an entire world depended on my ability to drop from this rooftop and not end up splattered on the cracked pavement below. I drew in a breath slowly. This was something I'd always dreamed of doing, and I knew Jarek would catch me if anything went awry, so mustering every bit of confidence I had, I leaned forward and stepped off into empty air. My stomach shot into my throat, my heart thundered wildly in my chest as I plummeted toward the pavement below, my life flashing before my eyes. Then a snap and a tug across my chest before all my insides felt as though I had left them behind. The wings caught the breeze, and I shot forward with such force I nearly gagged on the air. Jarek shot past me, and I triggered another rocket. Jarek circled around me, pointing to a spot on the ground far below us, and dove headfirst before pulling up in a short circle and landing with hardly a bump. I made wide circles over the area, attempting to slow my descent, but 5 meters above the ground, I heard a tick, and the tension across my chest released. I fell out of the sky, hitting the ground with a jarring thud, followed by some very unqueenly words. Jarek laughed until I glared at him, and then said, "You did pretty good for a noob." "I nearly broke my neck," I said, my butt cheek still hurting from landing on a rock. "Let me show you something." And so for the next few hours, Jarek taught me everything he knew about flying, landing, launching, and gliding. By the time we coasted back into the city, I was as good as I could get without practice. Over the next few days, I practiced flying every chance I could get. When I wasn't flying, we were holed up in Jarek's office, making plans to sneak into the Nether. Jarek wanted me to stay behind, but after a lot of arguing and point proving, I managed to convince him that I was the only person who could sneak into the Nether. It was the middle of the week when Susie, a young girl with big eyes, tapped on my chamber door and led me into the sewer before sunrise. By dinner time, I returned as a whole new person. "That Susie's mom sure can do some kind of magic," Jarek said, as he took in my disguise. I grinned. "As long as I don't have to talk to anyone, I should be fine," I said, my not very masculine voice in stark contrast to the way I looked. When night had fallen, I made my way out of the sewer outpost. I had gotten fairly confident with my wings, and I launched myself skyward toward another portal on top of a mountain. Ever since the portals had reopened, people had been building shielded rooms around them to hopefully prevent an invasion by nether creatures. Unfortunately, these rooms weren't very good at keeping humans contained, so the bandits still had full access in and out. Jarek had told me that this particular portal was never used by the bandits because of location, so getting through was easy. He wasn't wrong, and I stepped from the portal onto a basalt outcropping. Smoke and ash filled the air. The netherscape spread out below me, an endless dimension of heat and fire. I picked my way across the scorching landscape, over rickety bridges, and past strange, pig-like people who seemed to be unsure of whether or not I was a threat. I only had a vague idea of where I was heading, and I didn't know how long it would take to get there. I was glad I'd been able to leave Hope with Jarek. This was no place for a dog. After several unbearably hot hours of trekking through warped and twisted netherscapes, I finally laid eyes on what I was looking for. The Bandit King's castle, as dark and corrupt as the king himself. I had a plan that would get me in, and once I found out where the general was, I was supposed to return to the overworld and help Jarek plan his rescue. I hadn't fully agreed to that plan, though, and if I got the chance to rescue the general myself, I wouldn't hesitate to do so. I found a place to stash my wings in the canopy of a warped tree and began picking my way down the hillside to the slatted bridge that would lead me over a boiling sea of lava and into the hands of the Bandit King. Guards hovered near the door, but after looking at me and seeing a burly bearded man clearly in the mood for a little bloodshed, they assumed I was one of them, and no one looked twice as I walked right into the castle. The castle was built for defensive purposes and nothing more. The entry was small and plain. Narrow stairs led up on one side and down on the other. I didn't want to hang out longer than necessary, so assuming the general was being held in the dungeons, I opted for down. After a reasonably long descent, I found myself before a door that couldn't be anything other than an entrance to a dungeon. I pushed the door open as if I owned the place and stopped dead in my tracks. My stomach revolted and bile rose to the back of my throat. This was indeed a dungeon. The smell was atrocious, a combination of urine and vomit, and death and fear and pain. It took every ounce of will I had to stop myself from adding the paltry contents of my stomach to the filthy floor. Before me was a narrow hall, and to my right a door. I could see cells lining the hall, and hoping the general was in one, I checked them all. Some of the cells held prisoners who were starving and had clearly been tortured. Others held the remains of what had once been prisoners who were starved and tortured. None of them were the general. I was afraid of what I'd find behind the door, but I knew then that I didn't have a choice but to go into that room with the bloody handprints on the floor just outside it. handprints of someone who had been trying to escape before being dragged back through. I swallowed the lump in my throat and pushed my way into a scene out of a nightmare. A torture room, just as I'd known it would be. All manner of bodily fluids stained the floor, and puddles of thickening sludge oozed into drains in various locations. On one wall, a pig person was chained by his neck to the ceiling, chunks of his largest muscle groups missing as though they had been carved from a Christmas ham. Dead men were splayed out on tables at the back of the room. Bones lay in piles in the corners as though these monsters couldn't even be bothered to toss the bodies into the lava that surrounded the castle. And there, in the center of the room, suspended by his ankles over a roiling pit of lava, was General Whitethorn. I rushed to him, only to be stopped by a magical barrier. I bounced back in momentary shock. The general writhed, clearly screaming, but I couldn't hear a sound. The barrier was impenetrable, soundproof. This was a trap. Just as that realization dawned on me, the chain fell away and General Whitethorn plummeted headfirst into the lava, disappearing below the surface without a sound. I didn't have time to react before I was knocked out and dragged unceremoniously into a stinking cell. I woke up into darkness with a splitting headache. I didn't have to reach up and touch it to know I had a massive knot on the back of my head, but I did anyway. I didn't know whether or not they knew who I was yet. I wasn't sure if the glamour still held, and I had no way of finding out until someone came to get me. Part of me hoped it would be a long time before that happened. Unfortunately, my luck had run out the moment I'd been foolish enough to fall for the trap, and some time later, though not late enough for my liking, a scarred and brutal face appeared at the door to my cell. "Who are you?" a harsh, gravelly voice demanded. I winced visibly, my thundering head not keen on the sound of his too loud voice. "I said, who are you?" he boomed, his voice reverberating through my cell as if it were a chamber 1,000 times bigger than it really was. At least he didn't know who I was. With as much bravado as I could muster, I attempted to deepen my voice as I said boldly, "Who do you think I am?" The King of Bandits' face fell momentarily, and then abruptly shifted into a massive grin as he bellowed out a laugh that resounded through the dungeon and rattled my aching brain. "You look like a man, but you sound like a boy," he roared, laughing even harder. "Your misfortune is very humorous to me," he said, clearly trying to regain his composure. I glared at him from where I stood. He was an ass. I couldn't wait till I got the chance to chop his head off. "Now," he started again, having regained his angry visage, "who are you?" "If everything goes to plan, I'm your worst nightmare," I said in return. "Have it your way, then," he said, and walked away as though he truly didn't care. I listened to the clunk of the outer door as it closed and considered the reality that my attitude might one day get me killed. Time passed. It could have been days or weeks. I don't know. Time doesn't work the same in the Nether, but I found myself standing in a large room before the King of Bandits himself. "You've fared well in my dungeons these past few cycles," he said. "Most men crumble at the screams of the tortured. Most men fear their next. Why are you so different?" he asked. I momentarily contemplated telling him I wasn't a man, but that seemed like a dangerous game to play, so I opted for flattery instead. "I wanted to join you. You're the greatest bandit ever, so I came here to learn from you. Your men attacked me and threw me in a cell." "Ha! I don't believe it. Why were you prowling about my dungeon if you came to join us?" he said. "I just wanted to see what you could do. That's all, I swear it," I groveled, forcing an expression of fear and awe across my face. "I've always had to fight because of my voice. I was hoping you could use my skills and teach me more." "What of your threat when I spoke with you before?" "Wouldn't you be a little upset if someone smashed you over the head and threw you in a dungeon full of piss and vomit? I've had time to calm down now, and I get it. I do. I deserved it. I should have come right to you," I said, and then, with a taste of self-hatred coating my tongue, added, "Your Majesty." After a bit more back and forth, I managed to convince him I was just an idiot would-be bandit who'd made a bad choice. I was given a room at the top of the castle, and after being warned that I was being watched, I was left on my own. I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew for sure that I would not return to the overworld until the King of Bandits was dead. It was some time later, many cycles having turned, that I found myself once again standing before the King of Bandits. Rage oozed from my pores as I struggled to control myself while trying to come up with a way to refuse the task he set before me. I wouldn't survive a battle with all these men, but there was no way I was going to do what he was asking of me. There was no way I was going to kill anyone to prove my allegiance to him, and certainly not the leader of the Winged Elite. Suddenly, a strange look flashed across the Bandit King's face, and as I looked at my hands, I noticed that they seemed to flicker. The glamour was failing. I needed to get out, and fast. I don't feel well, I said, trying to think of anything that made me want to vomit, hoping it would help sell it. I think I'm going to hurl. I gripped my stomach and moved toward the door as though I was afraid I'd puke right then. Stop! The king roared. Sweat dripped between my shoulder blades, not the sticky humidity sweat of the nether, but real stinking fear sweat. My hands flickered again. The king circled around me slowly. Who are you really? He said. And why shouldn't I slit your throat where you stand? I glared at him. I was fully armed. We were alone. There was a chance I could take it. My hands flickered again. Once. Twice. Then the glamour sputtered, as if running out of gas, and failed completely. You! He bellowed, stepping back and drawing his sword. I'll have your head for the death of my brother. I dodged his swing, returning one of my own, missing by a hair. He killed my family, I growled back. Rage engulfed my senses. I felt wholly alone in the world, my father and brothers murdered in our home. No one left to care about my grandmother's legacy, except an uncle who wasn't even a blood relation. For a brief moment, rage gave way to sorrow, but then, as if some angel whispered in my ear, I remembered what I'd left behind in the overworld. My dreams for a better future. My best friend. My dog. And suddenly, as though filled with the power of the gods, I let loose a roar that set the entire castle shaking. I leapt forward and laid into the king of bandits' sword first. He hardly had a hope. Within moments, I stood over his lifeless body, panting. Without a king, this kingdom would fall. After escaping the nether and returning to the overworld, Jarek and Hope and I set out on foot for my uncle's village. There was simply no way for a dog to fly. Walking would take a couple of weeks, but the trip would be peaceful with the Bandit King gone. I was sure the future would hold many more perilous adventures, but I was happy to enjoy a little downtime with my two very best friends. What a story! I loved writing and making the videos for it. Thank you so much for hanging out until the end. If you've been around the channel for a while, you know how huge it is for me to have finally finished a series. I couldn't have done it without all the support from my amazing group members, incredible roommates, and most of all, you, the viewer. Thanks for sticking around, and always remember, the story doesn't end just because the credits roll. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Love ya. Bye!
Sometimes you just gotta believe